is a great series of games. It has left its mark not only on game dev, but also on cinema and even on music. What other horror game can boast such cultural impact? Yet, no other horror series had such a hard lot either. If you present it in the form of a diagram, it'll be a real roller coaster. There will be epic rises, breakneck falls, and unexpected loops. All this Disneyland lasted less than 15 years. But the events that took place during this time would be enough for 3 smaller franchises. In this video, we will be remembering the birth, the growth, and the death of the legendary Silent Hill. We'll try to avoid spoilers, but it's impossible to omit them completely, so be warned. Or better yet, play the whole series yourself. It's definitely worth it, trust me. You're on Dragmatic. Be sure to subscribe and smash the like button. And we're off. Unfortunately, the length of the video won't allow for an in-depth look at each Silent Hill in detail. The series has so many various spin-offs for every possible platform that talking about each of them would turn this video into a series of its own. The franchise has even released projects on the Game Boy and PS Vita. We'll honor them with a couple of words, but later. It's better to start from the beginning, from the year 1999. At that time, the world was rapturously gazing at a completely different game. The trend in survival horror genre was being set by Resident Evil. Fixed cinematic camera, weak and clumsy protagonist, measured gameplay. This was the formula that the Japanese publisher Konami decided to try and replicate and gave this task to the Team Silent studio. Only they chose an approach that was a bit different. Instead of a genetics-themed nightmare, we were given the heavy mysticism with dark cults and human sacrifice. Instead of the zombie-filled Raccoon City, there was the foggy Silent Hill. Instead of jump scares, there were psychological horrors. Yes, Silent Hill took a lot from Resident Evil, but it had even more of its own. For example, it offered real 3D instead of pre-rendered backdrops and more or less normal acting instead of the parody that was in Capcom's game. Joseph! But much more importantly, for the first time in the genre's history, a game was able to break the shackles of a B-horror and make an emphasis on psychology instead of cheap scares and snarling dead. To provide an analogy with movies, Resident Evil was like a Romero's film, cool, noisy, and fast-paced. Silent Hill, on the other hand, was definitely done by Lynch, much less shooting and much more mystery. Actually, Keiichiro Toyama, the director and scriptwriter of the first Silent Hill, even said in an interview with Polygon that he didn't plan on making his brainchild that scary. He himself has always been afraid of gory horrors, had never developed one, and wanted to make a puzzle-type game. A mind-bender, not a horror. So he was rather stumped that someone found the game to be frightening. Looks somewhat like the story of Shinji Mikami, the father of Resident Evil, don't you think? Before the franchise, he too was busy making children's arcades under Disney licenses, not horrors. Ever played Aladdin? Or Who Framed Roger Rabbit? His work. Only he, who is terrified of his own creation, can make a truly terrifying game. In Toyama's creation, of course, the main mystery inducer was the snowy Silent Hill. Yes, the ash falling from the sky was introduced later, in the movies. In the original, it was regular snow, only in the middle of summer. Apart from that, Silent Hill looked like an ordinary American resort town. But if you dug deeper, it was like Twin Peaks, full of mystery and innuendo. A town where the monsters are not what they seem, where the boundary between reality and imagination is so thin that it is often impossible to distinguish one from the other, where you can receive a letter from your dead wife and find your own corpse in a hotel, where every Laura Palmer has so many skeletons in her closet that it's better to stay out of it if you don't want to become one of them. The fog flooding the streets was an genius game design decision. It was masterfully saving the modest resources of the first PlayStation, as the console no longer had to process the objects far away from the player. But most importantly, the fog became a brilliant tool for creating an atmosphere of mystery and fear. You never know what monstrosities lurk behind its grey puffs. After all, as we all know, there's nothing scarier than a closed door. The vague ambiguity was complemented by the aesthetics of rusty metal and the absolutely fantastic soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka. The fun thing is that when the composer presented the fruits of his creativity to the rest of the team, he had to explain that all the noises coming from the speakers was the music and not a program malfunction. This grotesque but paradoxically harmonious city was the world that the protagonist Harry Mason found himself in. A simplistic plot about the search for his missing daughter Cheryl quickly turned into something sinister, mysterious, and extremely Japanese. Silent Hill's story weaved together infanticidal cultists, their dark god, little dead girls, soul separation, and hell on earth. All of that was presented through such a variety of hints, allusions, and innuendos that until the very end, it was unclear whether the events were transpiring in reality or in someone's fever dream. Yes, in some places, it was downright delirious. In many respects, this is the merit of the Japanese developers. They had never been to America, and their work shamelessly mixed theology, philosophy, Kabbalah, alchemy, and the most vulgar pop cult. In the story, you can find almost a direct quote from Jacob's Ladder, where in the bad ending, it turns out that all the events of the game are just the deathbed delirium of the protagonist.
He's gone.
The appearance of nurse Lisa Garland was taken from the movie The Exorcist 3. The main character got his last name Mason from the actor who played Humbert in Kubrick's Lolita. But even this eclecticism was unable to kill the atmosphere, the foundation of any horror. The flashlight's feeble beam illuminates the darkness barely a couple of meters away. The radio, whose hissing should warn you about monsters, doesn't calm you down, only frightens you even more. The protagonist exudes weakness literally on a physical level. All of that created such an effective presence that the game could be forgiven all gameplay and plot flaws. For example, homogeneous repetitive monsters, or the need to constantly bump into closed doors, which there seem to be hundreds, or the surreal and illogical puzzles completely unrelated to the events happening around. Remember the notorious piano puzzle in Midwich School? Well, at least the devs from Konami spared us from fiddling with a tiny inventor and the necessity to count every bullet. Man, if only they had also removed the wretched combat system with tedious fights. But apparently, the cultural influence of Resident Evil was too strong, so the psychological horror got an absolutely unnecessary action component, which remained the Achilles heel of the series until the very end. Fighting monsters wasn't just difficult, it was extremely inconvenient. Harry was moving as he was in a thick muddle. The cinematic camera took whatever angles it could, as long as they didn't include enemies. The weapons felt plastic at best. It was like a nightmare, the kind where you're suddenly attacked by something creepy, but you cannot fight back nor run away. Well, a feeling mostly suitable for a horror. To be fair, some games in the franchise managed to abandon combat at all. For example, in Plain Novel, a visual novel based on the first game, although it didn't make it any better. Fortunately, this nightmare was never officially translated from Japanese. I think it's for the best. There's quite a lot to say about this project, but we've already agreed to skip all the games that aren't part of the main series. It would be better to talk about them in detail in a separate video dedicated to spin-offs and cancelled Silent Hill projects. If you'd like to see that, be sure to let us know in the comments. For now, we'll get back on track. After finishing Silent Hill, its leading developers left for other projects. However, the game turned out to be extremely successful. It got excellent reviews and sales. Metacritic users still give the first Silent Hill 8.9 points out of 10. Konami management saw the potential of the new title and decided to make hay while the sun shines. So the departure of key employees didn't prevent Team Silent from starting the development of the second part, albeit with other people in their team. It's worth mentioning that Team Silent is a very ephemeral thing. This name is often associated with a group of developers that made the first 4 games in the franchise, but in reality, it wasn't a tight-knit collective of like-minded people. In fact, it was a team of outsiders. It harbored Konami employees who didn't fit into the general paradigm of the company for whatever reason. All of them were going to look for other jobs, and the fact that they were entrusted to create their own game was more like an experiment. They weren't really expected to succeed. Perhaps that's why they were able to break free from the established genre canon and turn Silent Hill into what it eventually became. Here, there was no visionary like Hideo Kojima or Shinji Mikami who would carry the series on their backs with a group of close associates. Yes, some people had worked on a few installments. For example, Masahiro Ito created monsters for the original trilogy, while Masashi Tsuboyama designed the city. It was thanks to him that Silent Hill became what we know it to be. Some developers had even worked on different parts of the series in completely different capacities. For example, Akira Yamaoka, who made the music for almost the entire franchise, including the movies, personally produced several installments. The worst in the franchise, but still. Keep that in mind when we'll be saying that the game was developed by Team Silent. It's like saying the game was developed by Konami Tokyo, no more than that. So, after the release of the first Silent Hill, Keiichiro Toyama left Konami. He always said that his experience wasn't enough to manage the production of a blockbuster game. Therefore, the development of Silent Hill 2 was led by Masashi Tsuboyama, the environment designer and animator of the first part, and he clearly knew what he was doing. But perhaps it was the complete change of the team's leadership that changed the development paradigm. The second game in the series had almost nothing to do with the first one except for the location. Was that necessarily a bad thing? Absolutely not, because it was this approach that allowed the developers to move away from tales about cults and little dead girls and tell a story of their own. The deepest, most integral and psychological story not only in the Silent Hill series, but perhaps among games in general. It was here where the image of Silent Hill as the real protagonist of the entire franchise was finally formed. The resort ceased to be a mere decoration and started to breathe. It began to look at the player with its own eyes, hazed with whitish fog, reaching out to him with its great tentacles, threatening to devour him whole. Now, we're frightened not by the lunatics, but by the city itself, which had acquired a face, a mind, and an ill will. Let's compare the monsters. In the first game, Harry Mason was fighting the products of a little girl's nightmare. She was afraid of mostly what little girls tend to be afraid of: insects, dogs, adults. The infamous nurses were a reflection of her fear of hospitals. Evil dwarves in the school represented evil and cruel classmates. The split-head boss was a monster from a book she had read. The list goes on. In the second part, however, all monsters are born not of some extraneous force, but of the sick, traumatized mind of the protagonist himself. James Sunderland confronted his own fears and repressed sexual desires. Not without reason, the enemies from Silent Hill 2 have entire scientific studies full of symbolism and psychoanalysis devoted to them. Mannequins composed of 2 lower parts of a woman's body, flesh lips, both lustful and terrifying, and the famous Pyramid Head, arguably the most famous game monster. It's a living reflection of the main character's guilt. You don't even have to beat the entire game to guess whose face is hidden under the heavy mask of this clumsy mortal beast. Silent Hill turned from an objective nightmare created by one poor kid for everyone around her to a subjective hell, a personal torture chamber that tortures each of its guests in a unique way. The James, tormented by repressed guilt and a whole bunch of sexual complexes, it was one. The fat and lanky Eddie Dombrowski, it was completely different. For the poor victim of abuse, Angela Orozco, it was something else as well. This is visible during the battle with Abstract Daddy, when her own hell, albeit briefly, breaks into James's world. The game was released not on the first, but on the second PlayStation, and was much more technologically advanced. The ubiquitous fog and darkness were now complemented by the effect of an old film. This noise perfectly hid the imperfect textures and lack of polygons on the models. So Silent Hill 2 looked just fine. Akira Yamaoka, who had already begun to openly partake in the development process, wrote a soundtrack even better than in the original. The team paid a lot of attention to the sound design. There were more than 200 sounds of the main character's steps alone, but not all the effects in the game can be heard in the first place. Some of them are recorded at such high or low frequencies that the human ear cannot perceive them, but the subconsciousness can. If you have the fitting equipment, that is, perceive and feel anxiety washing over you. However, even if you play in complete silence, the process won't become any less disturbing. Perhaps it has to do with the realism, which had been improved a lot since the first part. For example, for the first time in the series, character animations were made using motion capture, and the appearance of each character was worked out down to the features of the skull structure. The voice acting has improved a lot in comparison with the first part as well. Everyone performed their roles live, right on stage, accompanied by the director, the crew, and a whole set of cameras. As a result, these were almost real, living people, not some faceless dummies who were suffering and dying on the screen, and that made the whole experience even scarier. At the same time, the developers had almost completely avoided any gory scenes, no tortures and dismemberment, which is very uncommon for a horror game. The game had almost no obscene moments either, even though it was almost all about sexuality in various forms, including sexual violence. Yes, there was the famous scene with Pyramid Head and a couple of mannequins, but it was more like a grotesque breakdance or death convulsion than rape. I mean, there wasn't even much swearing. So, what do we have? A relatively small amount of violence, by survival horror standards of course, a complete absence of exposed genitalia, an almost complete absence of swear words. Funny enough, but that's what made the game so mature and wholesome. It wasn't trying to shock you, it didn't need to. Silent Hill 2 already had everything to accomplish the main task, to scare the player. And it manages to do so even today, 11 years later. But of course, the game wasn't perfect. The combat system remained just as flawed, the controls inconvenient, the puzzles illogical, and the camera almost as dull as in the original. But all of this is insignificant. They didn't prevent Silent Hill 2 from becoming a true masterpiece, a game that comes out once in a decade, the game that largely determined the future of the series and the entire horror genre. Metacritic users gave the project a score of 8.6 out of 10, and critics gave it as many as 89 points out of 100, even more than the first installment. Unfortunately, that was the peak of the development of the franchise, which then had far more falls than rises. Some think the series died at part 5, some say it died at part 4. In reality, it happened much earlier. The franchise started experiencing major problems as early as after the original trilogy. There is a tweet by Masahiro Ito, the art director of the second and third parts of the series, where the developer says the following: Silent Hill 3 was supposed to be an arcade spin-off, a rail shooter, not a direct sequel to Silent Hill 1. Was a terrible plan. The sales of Silent Hill 2 were really not a good start, so I guess it was one of the causes of that. Also, that plan wasted much time and some budgets of Silent Hill 3. It wasn't Silent Hill Arcade. We'll talk about the latter later in the video. Right now, we should pay attention to to two things. First of all, Silent Hill 3 was originally conceived as a completely different game. Secondly, the resources that could have been spent on creating the best horror game of all time were wasted on some arcade game for arcade machines. True, in the end, we still got a new rightful part to the franchise, but not of the level we could have had. Plot-wise, Silent Hill 3 continued the first part to the series, ignoring the completely independent story of James Sunderland. Years passed, Harry Mason's adopted daughter has grown up, and now she herself had to return to the ominous Silent Hill. Once again, the stage welcomed the cultists, their ancient god, and the problems of motherhood. At the same time, there was much less psychology, riddles, and innuendos from Silent Hill 2. It could be seen in the gameplay, in the location's design, and in the monster's appearance. The combat has changed quite a lot compared to the second part. Now, there were more monsters, they became stronger and more dangerous. The arsenal of young Heather is way cooler than that of old Harry. The latter didn't have a rifle on his misadventures. Moreover, the melancholic and foggy Silent Hill gave way to some popsy scenery from a teen horror movie. All these amusement parks are no match for the previous creation of Team Silent. As for the monsters, of course, you can look for phallic or natal symbolism in them, but Robbie the rabbit is clearly no equal to Pyramid Head. All in all, there's very little left of psychological horror. That was the first step from an art house thriller to youth horror. From Lynch to Wong and Verbinski. It's a small step, but as the future will show, fatal one. Yes, it could have turned out quite differently. In an interview with GameWorld, the omnipresent Akira Yamaoka revealed that Silent Hill 3 was originally conceived as a standalone project within the series. Just like the second installment, this game was supposed to be a standalone adventure. It was planned as a game that explores the psychological depths and inner nightmares of another broken and tormented human. There was even a finished pitch of the script, but the fans allegedly demanded something completely different. They wanted a continuation of the original story. They wanted the developers to finish all the storylines, cover all the plot holes, and explain all the inconsistencies. And Konami management didn't think of anything better than to satisfy these demands. They took the creative freedom away from the developers and ordered them to please the fans. It certainly wasn't the best decision, but what happened, happened. But why? It's like that neither the publisher nor the developers themselves didn't fully understand what to do with their own brainchild. That's why they relied on the opinion of the abstract fans and made a burger instead of a beef Wellington. Not exactly refined, but everyone likes it.
Oh God, it's so good. So good.
That doesn't mean Silent Hill 3 is a bad game. It is still a great horror game that was a lot in store to scare you with. Take the scene in the hospital storeroom. Great soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka, who for the first time was also the game's producer. Now, his tracks had vocals as well. The Freudian design of some monsters still makes you shudder. In general, back then, in the beginning of the 2000s, the third part of the series looked pretty awesome, and nobody paid attention to the little things. In short, it wasn't that bad. The game got its 8.6 points out of 10 from Metacritic users. Had Silent Hill 3 been the last installment of the franchise, it would have been understood, accepted, and this video would never even have happened. But the series was far from being over. Along with the third part, another game was being developed in the dungeons of Konami. It was called Room 302 and had nothing to do with Silent Hill. But that's not how big businesses work. It was impossible not to tie the new horror to the iconic horror franchise. So Room 302 turned into Silent Hill 4, subtitled The Room. Maybe it was because of the producer Akira Yamaoka, an unmatched musician but an absolutely useless producer. Maybe it was because of the fact that the fourth part was made by people who had almost nothing to do with the third, the second, and even more so the first Silent Hill. But in the end, we got something very strange. There was even more action than in the third part. At the same time, it remained at the level of the first game, and we're talking about the basic mechanics. How the protagonist feels, how he walks, runs and fights. In this respect, Silent Hill seemed outdated even in 1999. But the more time passed, the more apparent it became that the series wasn't moving forward. Now, it was obvious that it wasn't just stagnating, it was degrading. Huge amounts of backtracking emerged out of the blue, which hasn't made any game better so far, except for Metroidvanias. We were now literally forced to constantly go to the protagonist's apartment to drop junk from the backpack. Yes, weapons were now breaking down, and the backpack got limitations that weren't there before. It was as if the developers decided to copy something from the devs of Resident Evil and chose the worst possible option. And to think, the first Silent Hill was different from its competitor in that it renounced the inventory fiddling. In the past, you never had to worry about the capacity of the main character's pockets. They were bottomless, and this gave the player the freedom to take everything he wanted. No distractions from the horrors and mysteries for the sake of survival. Surviving in Silent Hill in general was always much easier than in Raccoon City. And that was the philosophy of the series: survival in form, psychological horror in essence. Now, we were required to survive, as the word suggests, managing resources, fighting monsters, searching for new weapons. Why in the world was this necessary for a horror which claims to be psychological is unclear. The most frustrating thing is that Resident Evil was able to grow into a full-fledged 3D action game by the fourth part. It was scolded by many old fans, but it had dynamic combat and a proper camera behind the hero's shoulder. Silent Hill, on the other hand, was still in the previous century by the mid-2000s. However, even this wasn't actually the worst thing. The worst thing was that the game just ceased to be scary. The horror components was defiled even more than in the third game. Now, we were supposed to be scared of slippers that run on their own, a meowing piece of meat in the kitchen, and ghosts which you had to fight with a magic sword. The once benchmark horror was now balancing between trash and Japanese urban legends. The room was ugly, buggy, annoying, and unable to give a good scare. Neither immortal enemies nor omnipresent ghosts. Nothing could keep the player in suspense long enough. Just take the video with the burping nurses. If one of the symbols of the series has been turned into a laughingstock, what is there to say about the rest? Instead of mysterious, fog-shrouded Silent Hill, we're put in some grey ghetto, terrorized by a homicidal maniac. A cultist named Walter Sullivan is killing people to resurrect an apartment? In the game, the story sounded just as delusional, and it had nothing to do with the main city. Long story short, it was so unimpressive and underwhelming that if all of that happened in Derry, Innsmouth, or Amityville, no one would have noticed. Here, for the first time in the series' history, there was a first-person view and a user interface right on the screen. Novelties that the game could have done perfectly fine without. It would have been better to devote more time to the puzzles, which had completely rolled down the hill. So much in fact that the room, once again, for the first time in the series' history, lost the option to choose the difficulty level for puzzles, simply because they were simplified to the point of absurdity in favor of combat. The looks weren't as impressive as in Silent Hill 3 either. The decrepit engine was squeezing all the juices from the poor old PS2, but it was clearly time to retire. The only thing to remain top-notch was the soundtrack. But the game was beyond salvageable. I mean, what else to expect from the project, whose developers, according to their own words, were looking for inspiration and features in online games? Yes, I kid you not. The March issue of Game Developer magazine for the year 2005 featured a lengthy article dedicated to The Room. In it, the developers shared their experience of creating the game and mentioned, among other things, a fresh approach towards the inventory. Previously, when you opened the backpack, you could spend literally forever in there. The game would just pause and the protagonist was safe. Now, the pause has been cancelled. Switching your weapon or digging through the junk was only possible in real time. According to Akira Yamaoka and producer Akihiro Imamura, they borrowed the idea and even the interface design from online games. The producers, by the way, thought it had proved to be quite successful and even necessary to create tension. Great choice of exemplars! All the tension in Silent Hill used to be created by completely other means, but they just couldn't be bothered. On the other hand, according to the developers, one of the major flaws of their creation was the absence of the Joku UFO ending, traditional for the series. Well, now we know why we got a mess instead of Silent Hill. There were no aliens, and what's Silent Hill without them green bastards? Long story short, it was bad. Today, 8 out of 10 user score on Metacritic looks like a good enough result, but not for Silent Hill. Konami's management wasn't happy about the room's performance as well. As a result, Silent Hill 5 from Team Silent was never released, though it was planned to come out. The Japanese team even started working on it. The concept was also very interesting. The developers planned to scare the player during the day in broad daylight, a familiar, safe reality that begins to rot and fall apart. A great concept for an innovative horror, but it seems that the publisher stopped believing in the project's success to the point where they sold one of the most Japanese horror franchises ever to the Americans. That's how Origins was born. It came out in 2007 and became the rightful 5th part in the series, even though it was initially released on PlayStation Portable. Team Silent ceased to exist. To say that this fact did any severe damage to the franchise would be an overestimation. In the year 2006, a film came out which was decent, albeit a bit poppy. It was directed by Christoph Gans, the director of Brotherhood of the Wolf and Crying Freeman. The motion picture took the first part of the game series as a basis, even though it used the story and the universe rather frivolously. For example, instead of snow, the streets of Silent Hill were covered with ash, while Harry Mason was replaced by a woman named Ros da Silva. 6 years later, a poor sequel based on Silent Hill 3 was released, which ended the movie franchise. In the same year 2006, Silent Hill Play Novel was released for the Pocket Nintendo DX. 1 year later, Silent Hill Orphan was born, known in Europe as the first installment of the Silent Hill mobile series. It was a Java quest for mobile phones. By the low mobile standards of those times, quite a decent one, at least decent enough to get 2 sequels. But of course, it barely had anything to do with the main series, which followed the movies and crossed the Pacific Ocean, losing its serial title numbers along the way. It would never return to its homeland, but no one knew about it just yet. The funny thing is that Silent Hill's setting used to be America as seen by Japanese. Now, the game was in the hands of an American studio called Climax, the guys who made games about Power Rangers and SpongeBob. It would be strange to expect a revelation from them. Even the plot of Origins was not exactly original. It turned out to be a prequel of the first Silent Hill. The story of trucker Travis Grady dissected the well-known events of the original for yet another time, but didn't give the world anything new. What's interesting is that instead of a prequel to the first game, they originally planned a remake. Rumors about it came along with the information that the movie was in production. Allegedly, the game was supposed to be titled Original Sin, be released on PSP, and replace Harry Mason with the main character of the movie. Later, the idea was abandoned, but they never came up with anything better. By the standards of the legendary series, it was a disaster. The worst one you can imagine. Unattractive, unoriginal, just an unnecessary game with outdated gameplay and a weak narrative. You can blame Climax Studio for that, but Konami planned to turn Origins into a dark comedy about running away from monsters. Now, of course, humorous endings and all sorts of Easter eggs have always been a necessary part of the series, but to turn it into a clown act? The publisher would have never gotten away with such a sin. So, the Americans didn't do that bad. 7.5 points on Metacritic is quite a tolerable result, especially if you take into account the laughable budget and tight development timelines. And the omnipresent Yamaoka, the only one from the original Team Silent who worked on the project, did what he does best: an excellent soundtrack. Thus, the game received its average scores and was soon forgotten by everyone, but the franchise wasn't going to retire just yet. Ironically, the worst part of the series, fully dedicated to the US, were created by American teams. For Double Helix Games, Homecoming was the first try, although the studio, by the way, didn't consist of the industry's newbies. However, the fruit of their labors resembled a fan work, rather than a full-fledged sixth part of the renowned series. It was as similar to Japanese horror as the American The Ring resembled the original Ringu. The essence was the same, but the results were quite different. Things were so bad that Homecoming wasn't even officially released in Japan. Well, good riddance for the Japanese. Of the noteworthy innovations, there was only the dialogue system. Yes, now you could choose the dialogue lines, and it affected the ending, although it was used only 3 times in the whole game, so Silent Hill never became a full-fledged RPG, just as it never became an action game either. The main character was now a former military, which is why there once again was more action and less puzzles. The famous rolls and behind-the-shoulder aims are all about Homecoming. Why would a psychological horror need that remains a mystery. But truth be told, the series had lost the last crumbs of psychology a couple of installments ago, so we got just an American horror flick for teens, even though it was about Silent Hill. All attempts to get back to the psychological roots of Silent Hill 2 only ended with the involvement of Pyramid Head. What did James Sunderland's personal fear forget in the adventure of a random marine? All questions should be addressed to Konami's Japanese office. After all, it was its bosses and personally Akira Yamaoka who fully approved all this abuse of corpse. Even the original aesthetics of the series has taken a wrong turn. In an attempt to please the general public, who learned about Silent Hill only with the release of the movie, the monster design was copied from the motion picture. Thus, there now were masked cultists and ash falling from the sky like snow. Surprisingly, it didn't bring new fans to the series, but it pissed off the old ones quite a bit, the few who are still remaining. It seems that the Japanese themselves never fully understood what made their series this great. So if you have an urge to blame the Americans, who supposedly didn't understand the essence of Silent Hill, don't. Everyone was to blame for what the series had become. The publisher had no idea of how to develop the franchise. The fans didn't know what they wanted. The developers were trying to please everyone at once. The result was 6.6 out of 10 on Metacritic and unanimous disdain. The worst score in the series if we don't count the spin-offs and re-releases. The degradation could no longer be stopped. The series entered the Dark Age, but Konami continued to try milking it dry. The franchise even released a rail shooter for arcade machines, the Arcade, which we have already mentioned, and a mobile shooter called the Escape. Which of these titles was worse is still debated. The only beacon of hope in the late 2000s was Shattered Memories for the Nintendo Wii, which was decent, albeit completely different from the rest of the series. Oddly enough, it was created within the walls of Climax Games, the same people who were responsible for the flopped Origins. It went back to the story of Harry Mason, who is searching for his daughter Cheryl, only apart from the character names, the games had nothing in common with the original Silent Hill. The story here was completely independent and quite worthy actually. The developers took the concept of a psychological horror literally, so now, while you were playing the game, the program would make a psychological profile of the player himself, and quite an accurate one. From time to time, the player was asked to talk to a therapist and take a couple of tests. The answers influenced the course of the story. the characters, and the finale of the whole adventure. Even the aesthetics of Silent Hill itself have been reinvented. Now blood, rotten flesh, and rusted metal were replaced by ice. It turned out to be quite unusual and fresh, though not exactly Silent Hill-ish. However, the main advantage of Shattered Memories was that the game finally got rid of horror cliches, like the story told through notes. The developers, following the advice from Rodin and Occam, had cut off everything unnecessary. For example, they then tried to reanimate the wretched and crooked combat for the 7th time and just threw it in the bin. There even was no inventory. The only things that were allowed to use were keys and flares. The whole action component was essentially about running away from your own fear. And it worked beautifully, especially since the Wii's feature did a great job to ample the immersion. The console's gamepad also served as a cell phone. You could use it to call any of the in-game numbers, take pictures, and receive text messages. Largely thanks to such an unconventional approach, Shattered Memories received a score of 7.8 on Metacritic. This is of course even less than the score of the 4th part, but an excellent result for such a pathfinding project. Also, when the game was finished, Akira Yamaoka finally left Konami. He was involved with the series for over a decade, longer than anyone else. As a composer, he gave us some of the best game soundtracks in the history of game dev. As a producer, he brought the franchise to a complete collapse. A controversial but brilliant figure in his own way. But we're getting off track. Still, the Wii release was just an experiment for Silent Hill. All of the achievements of this groundbreaking and original installment remained no more than achievements. The series has once again returned to the classic formula of a survival horror game. After what happened to Homecoming, many people expected the franchise to head east again, but nobody expected that to be Eastern Europe. Surprisingly, the developers from Czech studio called Vatra Games managed to make quite an okay game, even though it hardly resembled Silent Hill at all. Perhaps it was the absence of Yamaoka in the credits. Downpour was the closest thing to the second part of the series, and that's already something. After the flop of Homecoming, it could be forgiven for its derivativeness, an excessively straightforward plot, and too many fights. All the more since Downpour had its own merits. Just take the Forever Rainy City, which was interesting to explore once again, for the first time in a decade. In general, the game certainly had an atmosphere. There are even some truly scary scenes. The involvement of psychology was once again making sense. It seems that the players and the press didn't receive Downpour well, mostly out of habit. On Metacritic, the game received a score of 7.2 out of 10. Of course, how can some Czech lads stand next to the great Japanese makers of the genre? In fact, had the game been released not only on consoles, and had it been the last installment of the series, its merits would have been recognized over time. However, Konami just didn't have the strength to end the franchise with something decent. First came the HD collection, which included the remasters of the original trilogy. Shamelessly lazy remasters at that. Even the redubbing with the participation of top actors like Troy Baker didn't save the day. Let's just say that some scenes in the HD re-release looked worse than in the original, not to mention the huge amounts of bugs. The fact of the matter is that the original code of the second part, for example, was simply lost by Konami, so the remaster was based on the glitchy beta version. The bugs, of course, were fixed later on, but the aftertaste remained. After HD Collection came Book of Memories, Diablo's unfortunate offspring for the PlayStation Vita that was just barely clinging to life at the time. The main problem here wasn't even that the combination of the franchise and the genre came out just plain stupid. It was just hard and boring to play. From then, Konami has only been able to mock the fans. About every 6 months, there are rumors about a new Silent Hill game, and every time it turns out to be some nonsense like a branded Packy slot. The last real attempt to revive Silent Hill was the playable teaser, or PT, for PlayStation 4. A free-to-play, first-person chamber horror disguised as a debut creation of a small indie studio had quite a surprise for its players in the finale. It's impossible to describe the reaction of fans at the moment when the title Silent Hills appeared on the screen, as well as the terrible disappointment when it became clear that there would be no Silent Hills and that Kojima had romped it with Konami. What a game it could have been! The lead role would have been played by Norman Reedus. Movie director Guillermo del Toro would be responsible for monster design. Horror manga artist Junji Ito would have given the project the unique aesthetics of his work. None of this was ever meant to happen. As a result, the next big project of the Japanese genius was Death Stranding, and the Silent Hill series seemed to have finally died. Until the rumors about a remake of the second part started spreading, which soon proved to be truthful. In the near future, we can wait for not just one, but several games about the universe. And who knows, maybe it will be the beginning of the revival of the once great horror series. But this is a topic for another video. That's it for today. Be sure to share with us in the comments which Silent Hill game impressed you the most and why. And don't forget to leave a like and smash the bell button. Stay tuned.